When I think of the Kelly sermon this morning and thinking of broken hopes and thinking in terms particularly of relationships, and we've been looking at the issue of forgiveness, and last week we talked about the nature of resentment and wishing people well. And what I'd like to focus on this morning is, and this is our objections to forgiving. What typically happens is that there are really two reasons why people don't forgive. And the first is simply they don't know how. And that's the point of this whole class, is to teach you how. The other reason that people don't forgive is because some part of them doesn't want to or objects to the idea of forgiving. And this is one of the reasons why you can forgive somebody one day and then the next day it's like all that resentment comes back. And so I want to look at what are people's objections to forgiving. And probably one of the ways to think about it is when you think of people who have hurt you, what are your objections to wishing that person well? Or wanting God to bless that person? And if you're anything like me, I can imagine you've got quite a few objections to that. But I am curious as to what people's objections are when they think of wishing someone who's hurt you well. And one of them we heard big time last week. Sort of the objection is that if you forgive this person, they're just going to keep on doing it. Whatever it is that offends you, aggravates you, drives you crazy. So that's one of them. But think about people, particularly maybe who have hurt you in the past. What are some of the objections that people have to forgiving? And particularly if you put it in the frame of wishing that person well. So you'll need to unmic yourself, but what are some objections you think that people might have? Anyone got any idea?
I want somebody who's hurt me to feel the pain that I feel.
Okay. So part of it is, the objection is they have no awareness to the hurt and distress they've caused you.
Or they might be aware and they don't feel remorse. And so
okay.
There's not an apology on that side, or
yeah. Mm-hmm. So it's kind of like they don't care. So why should I bother forgiving them when they really don't care about me? And they've never said I'm sorry.
My problem is that I outwardly forgive them, but it's like I've got this gum stuck to the bottom of my heart, like you get on your shoe. And so every time they come in my mind, my, mortal self goes, oh, remember when? It's like that gum on your shoe that you can't get off. And so it's like my heart wants to, but then my brain says, oh no, that's danger. That would be bad to forgive them because remember what they did.
Actually, that's a really cool point. One of the things that forgiveness, and we haven't really talked too much about this, but in terms of separating what forgiveness is and what forgiveness isn't, and Sarah's made a really good case, and I'll just speak to it now, is that forgiveness doesn't mean forgetting. In fact, forgetting would actually be really, really stupid. And And I think, for example, there's a delightful story. And I can't remember the author of it, but he tells the story about a man who really, really loves tigers. And he goes home from work every day past the zoo, and he's got sort of an annual membership, so he always ducks into the zoo to see the tigers. And so he's standing at the tiger, telling the tiger how much he loves him, and the tiger walks up to where he is, and he just thinks the tiger is so beautiful and wonderful, and he puts his arm through the bars to pet the tiger. And the tiger does what tigers do. He bit off his arm. And so the man is just really upset and angry and cranky, and he's just going through life with one arm, and he's just miserable, and he refuses to go to the zoo. He hates tigers. He hates the world. He just hates everything. And he meets this guy, and the guy says to him, "Boy, you're miserable." And he says, yeah, the tiger ate my arm. It's just really, really miserable. And the man says to him, "Dude, here's the thing. You got to forgive and forget that the tiger ate your arm." And the guy goes, "Wow, that's cool. That's cool." So he's feeling happy now, and he's sort of feeling happy, and he's walking home from work, and he sees the zoo, and he goes, "Oh, there's tigers, and I love tigers." And he goes in to see the tiger, and he's standing there at the cage with one arm, and he's just thinking, "Oh, tiger, you're so beautiful and handsome." And he says, and you all know what he did. He put his other arm in the cage to pet the tiger. We need to forgive the tiger. And we need to remember that tigers eat arms. And so
I love that image. Sorry, I love that image of resentment, though, as you can't get the gum off your shoe. You try, and there's always a little bit of resentment that sticks.
And I think a part of it is that's what I was going to say, is the part of forgiveness I think that's hard is that I've gone back too many times, and basically I got my arm bitten off too many times. It's like the story of the wife beater. If somebody's a wife beater and you go back and back and back, it's, someday you just have to leave because they're just not going to stop doing what they do.
And so, Nanette, you actually bring up the next piece that we need to really pay attention to here, and that is the difference between forgiveness and reconciliation. And this is a really important distinction, because forgiveness doesn't mean that we have to be reconciled to the person that we are forgiving. And a similar part of reconciliation, I think when we are being reconciled, part of what it is, we're entering back into a trusting relationship. And just because I've forgiven somebody, that does not make that person trustworthy. And so one of the mistakes a lot of people make, and the reason they won't forgive, is because they actually think that now that I've got to trust this person, and clearly makes no sense whatsoever to trust somebody who's never demonstrated that they are trustworthy. And so we need to forgive and continue to not trust them. Now, this brings us back to the difference between forgiveness and reconciliation. And this, I'd say, the biggest problem in the church particularly is people confuse those two things. So here's what forgiveness is. Forgiveness is setting yourself free from what somebody else did to you in the past. It's letting go of your demand that yesterday they would have been different. Reconciliation is actually an agreement between two or more people about how they will live and act together, be together in the future. So forgiveness is about looking back. Reconciliation is always looking into the future. And it would be stupid to be reconciled to someone who's going to continue to beat you up, do whatever, that makes absolutely no sense to me whatsoever. And so this is Rob's rule of reconciliation. Never be reconciled to someone who doesn't share your values. Because if you're being reconciled to someone who doesn't share your values, you're going to end up incredibly compromised. And I'm hoping one of the things that you deeply, deeply value is yourself. And you would never entrust yourself to someone who cannot cherish you. Makes no sense to me at all. And this is where we need to look at what Jesus is saying. You think about the story of Good Friday, and they're pounding nails into his hands and feet. And what does he say? He says, Father, forgive them, because they don't know what they're doing. But while Jesus forgave them, I am totally convinced he was never reconciled to the mission of the Rome. He was never reconciled to the mission of the Pharisees and the scribes. And when we think about Jesus before Pilate, I don't think Jesus trusted Pilate. And he certainly didn't entrust himself to Pilate. Now, Pilate had total access to Jesus' body. But Pilate never had access to Jesus' soul. And I think that's why when most of the time that Jesus was before Pilate, they have this crazy kind of conversation about power. But for the rest of that time, Jesus was silent. And if you think back to when we were talking about compassion is made up of tenderness, fierceness, and mischievousness, I think Jesus was fiercely silent before Pilate. Because when we think of the cross and Jesus on the cross, the end, he says, Father, into your hands I commend my spirit. The Romans didn't take his spirit away from him. The scribes and Pharisees didn't take it away from him. He gave it to God. And so a big piece of this is to think about reconciliation. And Jesus was never reconciled to the Romans, to the scribes and the Pharisees. He also said something else. He says, when you go into the town, say peace to the town. And if the peace is not returned, leave and shake the dust off your feet. And this idea that we're supposed to give people sort of 100% unconditional access to our being makes absolutely no sense to me at all, particularly in the light of what Jesus taught. He also said, and I'm not crazy about calling anyone a pig, but he said, never cast your pearls before swine. Don't entrust people who can't cherish it, what you deeply value. And each one of you, your greatest pearl is yourself. Never give anyone access to the essence of your being if they can't cherish it. And so I make a big distinction between forgiving someone, which is, as I say, setting me free from that bubble gum that's sticking to the bottom of my heart, Sarah, to set me free from that. But reconciliation is about the future. And and this is the other thing, just because you've forgiven them, that forgiveness will change you, but it will not change that other person. And just because you've forgiven them doesn't mean that they have miraculously become trustworthy. And there will be people who will use that against you, and they say, well, you're supposed to be a Christian, you're supposed to forgive me. And here's what you want to say to a person who says something like that to you. It's like, and I can think, for example, of a person who was running a big nonprofit, and she was the manager of it, and she had an employee that was really not working well at all, and was just a pain in the butt for everybody in the organization. And so she fired him. And he said to her, "I thought you were a Christian and you were supposed to forgive me." And what she would have to say is, "I do forgive you. I'm just not reconciled to you working here anymore." One is looking back. The other is looking to the future. And so we can say to these people, I do forgive you, but I am not reconciled to having a relationship with you as long as you continue to behave the way that you do. So there's a couple of the big things. Are there other, Kelly?
I have a question.
Yep.
While the forgiveness that we offer changes us, would you say that it's possible that our forgiveness could change the other person, but there's no guarantee?
I would agree that there's no guarantee. I would say it's in the light of our forgiveness that the person may have the freedom to forgive us. And so I do think that forgiveness is the first step in that transformed relationship. And someone's got to make the first step. And I think particularly in lots of situations where there has been hurt, that forgiveness enables the possibility of a new future. So yeah, I think our forgiveness can be the first step in transforming that relationship. And it's kind of like in the light of our forgiveness, the person may be able to think about what they have done and how they need to be different in the future. So it very much, and I would say that if you have been hurt and you want to be reconciled, then forgiveness is an essential part of it. Without forgiveness on both sides, there really can't be any reconciliation. So yeah, so if we come back and think about other objections that we have to forgiving. Anyone else think of others that may come up?
May I ask a question?
Yeah.
How does the expression and the incident of turning the other cheek come into this? And wasn't there an incident in the Bible where Jesus basically is said to have turned the other cheek, but I don't know how that works.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think that the interesting thing for me, Van, when I read that is notice that he's saying, turn the other cheek. And here's what happens typically in many situations. Now, if we go back to the sort of stereotype that Nanette raised about the person who's being beaten up by her husband. And each time she goes back, she says, well, I got to turn the other cheek. But is she turning the other cheek, or is she still presenting the same old cheek? And basically saying, hit me again, hit me again. And I don't think that's turning the other cheek. Turning the other cheek would be going, I'm leaving. And I ain't coming back until you stop this behavior. Now, she may get hit on the other cheek. It's not the same cheek. Now, I know there are other ways to interpret that passage, but that's one of the things that that comes to my mind when I think of that. It is not presenting the same old cheek. It's really changing and presenting the other cheek. doing something radically different. And yeah, you may be abused for the other cheek, but it's going to be different. So I don't know whether that's the way I interpret that passage. I think depending on the circumstances, there are other places, there are other ways to interpret that. But I think in terms of the forgiveness work that I've done with people, that they're not changing at all. They just continue to repeat the process over and over again, expecting that somehow miraculously this other person's going to change. And until they change, I don't think there will be any change in the other. So there are a
Rob,
couple of, yeah.
oh, sorry. I talk with my psychologist weekly about the definition of insanity. And the definition of insanity is doing the same thing over and over again and expecting a different result. And whether that's trying to make a wall a door or make an abuser not an abuser. And so I just wanted to add that it's not insanity per se, but I think that's when we really need to recognize a pattern that we're not trying to get out of that burden. We're just repeating the same thing over and over again and hoping it will be different. And so that's where the change, at least for me, through my work, has come about, because I see the wall as a wall. I see the abuser as an abuser. I see the tiger as a tiger arm eater. And so I don't expect different behavior. I don't expect a house to magically become a car. So, I mean, I think I beat the horse to death, not meaning to, but I think everyone gets the point that,
I think you're right. I mean, in the sense of making sure, really the only person we can change is ourselves. And over again, we keep waiting for other people to change, thinking our life would be better if other people change. And particularly I think I've mentioned this before, the frame that you can put that in is when people are saying, I will be happy when, and after the when, particularly, this is a really good way to be super miserable, is you say, I will be happy when somebody else changes their behavior. And if you want to really maximize your misery and get miserable really quickly, think of someone who really doesn't care about you. And then say, I'll be happy when that person changes. And all I can tell you, if that's what you're saying, you're going to be miserable for a really, really long time. That is just not smart at all. So we come back to some other things that cause people to object to the idea of wishing somebody well. And one of the key ones is they'll just do it again. And here we need to pay attention to the person's safety. If someone is in an abusive relationship and what they're doing there is using resentment as a mechanism to stay safe. Now, it's not a very effective mechanism. In fact, it's really not a good mechanism at all. But what happens is that, particularly if they don't know anything better, I would say it's very unethical to teach someone who's in an abusive relationship to forgive until we've found them an alternative way to stay safe. Now, if we go back to the sort of domestic abuse situation, it would be getting that person into a safe house. Alternatively, it could be that the person who did the abuse has been gone for 20 years. And if you talk to them, well, so does any part of you object to the idea of forgiving this person? They say, yeah, if I forgive them, I'll let somebody else into my life who will hurt me. Now what we need to do is help them find an alternative mechanism between their ears. But I still think it would be unethical to teach that person to forgive until we've provided an alternative strategy for them to stay safe. And so that's one of the objections I really do take very, very seriously, is that when people are using resentment as a strategy to stay safe, we need to help them find an alternative strategy, because it's not an effective strategy and it is enormously energy consuming to keep up a blanket, if you like, of resentment around you to protect you. Or if we took Sarah's metaphor as sort of encapsulating your heart in bubble gum. Yeah, that would keep it safe, but it's probably not a good thing to do. And it's also going to mean that you aren't going to experience other people's love in your life. Because what I know about when you're in a state of resentment, it's like you look at the whole of the world through these eyes of resentment. And you can't see all sorts of things around you. You can't see that other people love you. You can't see the beauty of the spring that we see. You can't see that God loves you. All you know is this bad thing that's happened to you and the resentment that you continue to carry. So that's one objection. Then there's a whole bunch of others. And I think of some of the other objections. I can imagine some of you may just have this sort of gut feeling. It's not fair. Why should I be forgiving the person when the person's done what they did? They need to be punished. And it's just not fair that I have to do the forgiving. And particularly when they haven't acknowledged what they did. In fact, they may not even have any insight into what they did and how they hurt you. And you think, gee, this really isn't fair, that I'm somehow supposed to be the one who's doing the forgiving. I think of a lady I worked with, and she was in New York, and I live out here in Oregon, and she was living in New York. This was probably 15, 16 years ago. And her objection was, well, how will the world know that this guy's a jerk? And I really think she was concerned, particularly for her fellow sisters in the world, that somebody else would get tangled up with this guy who was really a jerk. And so her attitude was, well, if I forgive him, how will the world know? And I thought so I asked her, I said, well, how long have you been resenting this guy? And she says, about 20 years. So for 20 years, she's been resent. And I said to her, well, now, I was at a bit of a quandary then, because there are two possible, I like to help people, right? And so I'm thinking, well, how can I help her? Because here's what I know about her. She is a really, really pitiful resenter. And I said to her, I got to tell you, you're a really pitiful resenter. I mean, you've been resenting this person for 20 years. And I live in Oregon. And I got to tell you, lady, your resentment hasn't gotten across the Rockies, because I've never heard of this person. Now, this was back before Facebook and some of these other social networks that we have. But I suggested to her what we needed to do was take out a big, huge one-page advertisement in the New York Times saying, beware, this guy's a jerk. And at which point she started to laugh, because she realized at that point that she was using resentment as a way to communicate something or to get this person to change. And I would also say that often, particularly, for people who are waiting for the other person to apologize. And some of these folks have been doing it for years and years, and the person hasn't apologized, which again raises a couple of questions. Either they're a really pitiful resenter, and we need to teach them how to resent more effectively, or it could be maybe a combination of both. Maybe the other person's a really slow learner. But here's the thing that I would suggest: whenever you're making your forgiveness dependent on the other person changing, just know you're probably going to have a long wait. And the question I have for you at this point is, how are you going to wait? If you want to wait resentfully, have at it. But if you want to get on with your life, then I would suggest you want to forgive.
I wanted
And while I'm not, go ahead, Catherine.
I wanted to point out, I think, another dynamic in the abuse cycles. A device that abusers often use is to tell the person he or she deserved the treatment, that the abuse is justified. And I think when someone has heard that over and over and over again, part of what's difficult in forgiveness is the confusion. If I forgive, am I saying I deserve this and it was my fault? And that discernment between how have I contributed and how am I truly a victim, I think can be very, very confusing in those situations.
I would totally agree, Catherine. And I think a big piece here in terms of the forgiveness that we need to be working on there, and part of it is, and this is where a couple of weeks ago I talked about what's the value that's being violated here, and saying forgiveness isn't condoning. Forgiveness is really about saying what you did was wrong. You may also have the situation in which the person also has to acknowledge, and what I did by staying in that relationship was wrong. And we'll get to this in a couple of weeks' time, where it's like the person there we need to also forgive as ourselves. And self-forgiveness becomes really important when we recognize how we were in some way contributing to this pattern and this cycle. And so we need to forgive the perpetrator, but we also need to forgive ourselves for sticking in that relationship or our part in that whole process. So those are very important things to pay attention to as we unravel all of this.
Rob, one of the things that my mentor would always say to me is, son, there's 2 nickels in that dime. Meaning, look at your role in that. Yeah, this happened, but look at your role. So he would always say, there's 2 nickels in that dime. So
yeah, and I think as long as we say that, but not from a place of blame, I think that's where we can blame ourselves, and in our society, one of the things that we often do is blame the victim. And that just can be incredibly crazy making. And I think of Jesus, for example, a couple of weeks ago when we had the man born blind and that story, and it's like, whose sin caused this man to be blind? And Jesus, look, we are not going down the path of blame. And so, yeah, we need to take account of our part. What's our nickel? And what's the other person's? And to be able to set ourselves free from both without a sense of blame or shame, which is similar. I want to keep looking at a couple of the other things. Now, some people will just simply have this idea, it's not fair. Why should I do the hard work? And my attitude or my response to people who are in that situation, firstly, is to affirm the sense of wanting fairness. Say, yeah, you're right. I think fairness is incredibly important, and I'm really glad that you are really interested in fairness. And if you are so interested in fairness, here's the thing to think about. It's not fair to you for you to keep carrying this burden. It's time for you to put the burden down. Because surely that would be fair. Now, you could try and get the other person to carry the burden, but I can tell you that'll be a waste of time because they're not interested. But it may be yours to put down. Or, in a sense, why do you keep punishing yourself by carrying this resentment? And if it's about deserving, and it's kind of, I think, it's almost sort of a black and white kind of thing here in terms of there's two sides of it in the sense of, do any of us deserve to be forgiven? And I think we all deserve to be forgiven. So it's both. In the one sense that we don't deserve forgiveness, and yet we are made to be forgiven. And the very nature of God. And so it really isn't a matter. It's a totally irrelevant concept of whether we deserve to be forgiven or not. The fact is, we are. And so if we are forgiven, and this is a big piece of the whole, what Jesus was saying, we are forgiven, and it's from that place of knowing that we are forgiven that we forgive others so that we can walk in the freedom of forgiveness. And this is just part of it. We're going to come back and do a whole lot more work in sort of bringing it all together next week when we look at the whole forgiveness process from beginning to end. But where I'd like to sort of leave it today, and as you think about this person that you are working on forgiving, to think about any objections you have to wishing this person well. And I'm happy to take emails afterwards if you've got a private thing that you're working on, personal thing in terms of particularly the objections that you might have. And the way I find that they will really surface is if you were to imagine wishing this person well. Now, I will also say that there are some people who have done some pretty wicked things. And wishing them well may feel an incredible stretch for you. So here's another metaphor for you. If you were to imagine a huge, huge ocean, or maybe a huge, huge lake, since you're all in St. Louis. If you were to think of one of the Great Lakes, Michigan or something like that, Superior, that's just vast. You can get out in the middle of it and all you can see is basically lake. But if you were to think of a huge, huge ocean, lake of unconditional love, God's unconditional love. And the question I have for you is, where do you need to be in the lake? And where does the other person need to be in the lake? So that you can both be in this lake of unconditional love and be at peace. Now, I can imagine some of you are thinking, well, as long as they're under the lake, that would be okay. I'm not sure that's quite what I'm meaning. I think maybe a better solution at that point is they need to be over the other side of the horizon. Or it could be that they just need to be in the next harbor. But in your mind's eye, you can imagine yourself immersed in God's unconditional love. And if you were to close your eyes and imagine that big body of unconditional love. I know when I was a youngster, we would go to the beach, and I can remember this one time an aunt took me out over beyond the breakers to where the waves were just sort of, they'd rise and they'd fall, but they weren't breaking. And she took me out and taught me to float on my back, and I could float up a wave and down and up and down. It was one of the coolest things. And you can imagine just floating in this incredible ocean of unconditional love. And to know that this person who's hurt you is somewhere else in this ocean. And whatever's going on in their life is totally up to them and God. It's got nothing to do with you anymore. And they can be in that ocean of unconditional love. And you can be in this ocean of unconditional love. And so as you go about this week, thinking about the people who have hurt you, the people that you may resent, just being aware of any objection you have to forgiving that person. And here's the big piece that I'll end with. I don't want to overcome that objection. Simplest way I could do to overcome that objection is just simply look at you and say, well, Jesus told you have to forgive. If you want to be forgiven, you need to forgive. And if you don't forgive, you're going to fry. Now, when you think about that, that's incredibly violent. You've already been violated once. And if I was to overcome that objection, that would be just an act of violence. And that's not going to help at all. What we need to do is satisfy that objection. And so if you do have an objection, ask the part of you that does object, ask it, what would satisfy its objection? And particularly thank it for its objection, because in that objection is some wisdom that you need to pay attention to. Maybe an issue of safety. maybe an issue of justice and fairness. We want to know what would satisfy that objection. So, if there are any final questions before we finish for today?
I've got one, Rob.
Uh-huh.
Can we forgive? Can forgiveness be effective, I guess, if we don't actually share that forgiveness with the person we're forgiving?
Yeah, actually, and a really good good question, Kelly. And here's why. I would suggest that if you are forgiving somebody, you've got someone in mind, and you're walking through the process with them, don't try and communicate with them. Don't tell them you've forgiven them. In fact, if you do, I would just not communicate with them at all. Chances are, if you do try and communicate with them, two things will happen. One of them, it'll backfire in a sense of and there's several reasons, and you'd have to really check out your motivation. But most of the time, if we were trying to communicate that we have forgiven the person, we're actually trying to get them to acknowledge that they hurt us. Now, I wouldn't be surprised, and I know some of the people that I've worked with in the forgiveness process, that you do this work and then they contact you. And it's almost like out of the blue. And all I think of at that point is somehow in the spiritual realm that this person has realized that maybe it's now safe to talk to you. But I wouldn't actually suggest communicating with the person at all. Remember, forgiveness is all about how you deal with what's happened to you in the past. Now, if you want to be reconciled to them, then I think after you've done the forgiveness process, it would be entirely appropriate to contact them and say, hey, I would like to get together with you and talk about how we can go forward in terms of the future. And at some point, you will have to talk about what's happened in the past. And I would just urge a little caution in terms of someone who has clearly not demonstrated that they are a trustworthy person. I would not be suggesting that you want to contact them at all and be reconciled with them. That makes no sense to me whatsoever.
That makes forgiveness sound much more doable.
Well, yeah, and I think that's the big one of the things I think in the church particularly, people get it really crazy as I say, they confuse forgiveness with reconciliation. Notice what Jesus did when he came down off the cross, right? And he never went and he says, look, guys, he never said to the disciples, hey, guys, hang out here. I got to go talk to the Romans to get reconciled with them. He went looking for the people of goodwill. He looked for Peter and said, hey, Peter, I need to be reconciled with you. And we have that beautiful story of, do you love me?
Rob, this is Jeff. I would like to add real quick that Jesus taught us to think outside the box. He gave us an alternative. Our human species has sort of been a one-trick pony. We keep doing the same things, and one of the things about holding hatred inside is it's corrosive. And if you look at Martin Luther King, who, you know, they jailed him and separated him from his wife, and Nelson Mandela, they jailed him for over 25 years, and Gandhi, all three of those people thought outside the box and didn't let corrosive, the corrosion affect them. They looked towards the good and acted, and they did forgive their abuser, but they didn't allow the abuse to limit them. They opposed it in the best methods they could. They thought outside the box.
Oh, and I think you're right, Jeff, that the people that you mentioned are, you know, sort of incredible examples of people who forgave. But I'd also come back to this point, you know, think of Nelson Mandela or Martin Luther King. They forgave the people who were committing atrocities, but they were, you know, think of Mandela, for example. He forgave the people who locked him up in jail, but he was never reconciled to apartheid.
Yeah, yes, that's my point, that they proactively opposed evil and the recommission of ongoing injustice. So yeah, even if you have an abuser, if you leave, they can't abuse you anymore. But that doesn't mean you can't forgive them, etc.
Well, and I think this is where it becomes really important, because, you know, if you look at Mandela, for example, he remained committed to the overthrowing of the apartheid and that the regime that was causing apartheid. And here's part of why this ultimately becomes so powerful, is it's an incredible thing to forgive and to be fiercely determined to bring about change. And I think this is the big distinction I would make about the gospel, is that to be fiercely determined to bring about change rather than resentfully determined. Because I know when I am full of hate and anger and what have you, I end up causing more injustice. But the way of Gandhi, the way of Mandela, Desmond Tutu, the way of Jesus was that love is going to ultimately win here. And when you think of some of the stories of the jailers that Mandela related to, they could see in Mandela's response, something else is happening here. They would expect resentment, and they got respect. And I think of some of the stories that Desmond Tutu tells of people in South Africa when the people that he was dealing with expected resentment, and what they got was respect. And so the real permanent agent of transformation in our world is love. It's not resentment. And if we boil all that down just to our own personal lives, when we resent the people that we would like to change, they don't. In fact, I can remember one author saying, says, the people I hate don't change. And he said, I've never known anyone to change because I hated them. I would, from my experience, would say, I've never known anyone to change for the better because I hated them. But I know that my anger will just keep people locked in their anger. And so, yes, forgiveness, loving your enemies, that's radical thinking outside the box. Someone have a comment? I think we need.
I do. I'd like to say that's where the turning the other cheek comes in to me. So it's in that releasing your own personal hate. And I was going to say it differently earlier, but that, you know, we get our buttons pushed, and that's when there's a knee-jerk reaction that's typically as exactly as you described, which is not productive, and it's filled with our own anxiety. And if we can somehow suspend that, which is, I'm still, I only have an intellectual knowledge of this, it's not a personal experience, but if we can somehow suspend our own trigger mechanism, then we can just see the place where they're coming from, which may be a place of hurt and anguish themselves. And if we can see the hurt and anguish instead of the action that's being exhibited as a result of, which is the love that you talk about, and the love I think that God has for us, then we don't, you know, then we can remain, then it passes through us. It's just a thing, they say. It's not this horrible thing. I was thinking with the wife beater, you know, not everything is a beating. We may think it's a beating, but it's not a beating. It's just someone trying to express something ineffectively sometimes. Anyway, thank you.
Cool.
I would liken this whole discussion this morning to a wonderful group therapy session to help alleviate the resentment that all of us feel. And I think this distinction you've made between forgiveness and reconciliation is really key. And I want to thank you very much for helping me personally. And I'm wondering if you have had you made a fundamental distinction, but there are also some really subtle other distinctions you've made and advice you've given. And I am wondering, just as the sermons are available for a week, I am wondering if this session has been recorded in a way that for those of us who have participated, we could go back and view it again. I have found this a remarkable, this whole program you've got going, Rob, is wonderful. Thank you.
You're welcome, actually, and this is being recorded, Van, and my goal, and one of the part of the motivations to come back here to Oregon is I have a lot better facility. My goal is to actually go through the whole forgiveness process and record it so that people can literally go up to the website and play the whole thing and with somebody in mind and go through the forgiveness process. So yeah, but this one and last week's is recorded.
And Rob, if it's recorded, how do we find it? Because I would like to, interesting for me, a young girl that I talked to this week, pretty much I could just go down your checklist of what you said of, you know, she's really struggling with needing to forgive. I mean, but she's really at a critical point in her life. And I would love to be able to have her see this today, and then she and I even look at it together, because
Cool.
we decided to talk today because she was crying too hard. And I said, well, let's wait a day and let's talk on Sunday. But I can't help her. It's just what you said. She has got to let go of the extreme, anger she has right now. So is there a way she could listen to this today?
Yes. I think, and I'm not up on the website, we're building a page, which stpetersepiscopal.org, and I think it's /forgiveness.
Okay.
Is that where it is, Kelly?
I am looking. I think it's on. Jacqueline's putting them up on our YouTube page, but I wouldn't expect that this one may not be up today.
Okay, I'll email you, Kelly.
It'll take
it'll
take a couple of days, but
there is a way that it goes directly to the cloud, and so it just takes a little while for it to be moved over. She has a way of making it so that you can have access to it without a whole bunch of other people having access to it. So I think after we talk, we could determine if we wanted this session to be public or if we want only you all who are in it to be able to see it. That's something we probably could talk about.
The other ones, they are on the YouTube page, the coffee with Rob.
This is Jeff. I just had a quick suggestion, which you guys can ignore, process further. That is, our main webpage is sort of stuck back in the past when you could gather in a church and sit 2 feet from another person. If the web page for St. Peter's, you know, we don't need a map of where we are. If we could have active links on the front page for like the Sunday service and the Wednesday 7 p.m. and the today's 10:15, 8, 10:15, and 10:30 things. I think having active links would be best, especially for persons that may not be on Facebook or want to get involved with YouTube.
Jeff, the active links are on the News from the Rock on Friday so that they're not public. So we don't have a problem with Zoom bombing and other things. But they're all there in the email on Friday.
Okay, and you know, maybe the recorded things wouldn't have a Zoom meeting password issue. You know, maybe you could put a link on the front page.
Well, I think that's a big piece that you're pointing out, Jeff, is sort of the work in progress. And now that we're kind of getting a handle on doing Sunday services, we are able to migrate to taking care of some of these other things. But yes, having access to this material, and particularly some of it wasn't recorded, the stuff that I did before Easter in person, I do want to re-record that and to create an entire program to really take care of the question that Linda's asking, is how do we make this available? And it's a big part of my sort of mission in life. I call it my act of cultural sedition. I'm tired of living in a world of hate. So I'm on a mission to teach people how to forgive. So I want to just wish you all well this week, and we'll catch up with you next week. And if you do have any questions, please feel free to email me. It's robv@stpetersepiscopal.org. Have a blessed week, folks.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye, everybody.
Bye.
We missed you.
We miss you too, Fiona.
We'll be back someday.
We're counting on it.
All right. Bye-bye.